Hey, how's it going? My name's Ryan Ford, and if you're seeing this video, it's because you recently purchased my friend Mike Bidwell's book, BJJ After 40, The Survival Guide. Congratulations on your purchase. If you're not familiar with me or my work, I used to run the Grappling Central podcast for about 6.5 years, which was the #1 ranked jiu-jitsu podcast in the world. Today, I host the BJJ Fanatics podcast, which continues to be the #1 ranked jiu-jitsu podcast. And I've had almost 600 episodes with different champions and instructors and athletes from around the world. I've actually had Mike on the show a couple times, so make sure you guys go check out those episodes. But in the meantime, Mike was kind enough to ask me if I'd be willing to answer some questions from the Facebook group to hopefully provide some insight based on the conversations I've had with the very best athletes in the sport to maybe help you guys along the way in your own journey. So I'm going to go ahead and start reading off these questions, and I appreciate you guys sending them in for all the people that sent these questions to me. Question 1, after interviewing so many BJJ athletes, what would you say are the most common traits that they share? Great question. So something I notice across the board with all jiu-jitsu athletes at the very highest levels, they have a really high level of discipline. And this shows in their training, it shows in the structure of their life, their day-to-day routines. They all have a pretty regimented lifestyle, and they have a very high standard that they keep themselves to with diet and exercise and their commitment to their training. Another thing that a lot of the very top guys share is a real focus on improvement, like constantly trying to improve every aspect of their game that they can. They often don't sit back on their laurels or on their past championships or victories. They're always looking for the pieces of the puzzle that are still kind of fuzzy or still need sharpening. And I always find that inspiring, because when you see someone who's a multiple-time world champion who's obviously doing great with their jiu-jitsu, it's nice to see that even those guys are always obsessively focusing on, okay, what can I do better? What can be fixed? Rather than just kicking back and thinking, okay, well, I'm already sharp enough. I'm winning world championships, so I'm perfect as I am. So it's nice to know that even at the very high echelons of the sport, those guys are also still trying to pursue knowledge and improvement, which is nice for people like us that aren't at that level. Let's see, question 2. Can you share some key lessons or insights that you've gathered from your conversations with BJJ athletes? Yeah, another good question. So I think the biggest lesson that I've personally taken from any conversation I've had on the podcast came from Rafael Lovato Jr. And this was actually the second time I interviewed him. I've interviewed him a few times, but particularly the second conversation I had with him, he mentioned just kind of in passing that that he has to take down notes for everything he ever learns. And he says that he almost can't comprehend how someone could go into training, learn all the details and things that are thrown at you in any given class, and then go home and just expect to remember it when you've got, a family and kids and work and life and everything else. So that really hit me. I was a purple belt at that time when he mentioned that in the conversation. And ever since then, I started keeping a training journal, and it completely changed the development of my jiu-jitsu. My jiu-jitsu development skyrocketed as a result of taking notes and keeping a journal. And so that's something I always emphasize when people ask me, like, what I've personally taken away from the show and all the conversations I've had. 100% it's note-taking, and shout out to Rafael Lovato Jr. for planting that seed for me. Question 3, how have your interviews influenced or changed your perception of the sport of BJJ? I think that something that I've always really appreciated with getting to know these athletes and talk to them and pick their brains is that a lot of these guys are not former athletes. I would have assumed early on I'd be talking to a lot of guys that played football or maybe wrestled or at the very least were into physical activities. I've been really surprised to see how many non-athletic people got into jiu-jitsu, became athletic as a result, and then became real good athletes. A lot of these guys were real kind of nerdy guys, and I use that in a flattering way. They're smart people, and they were into more like comic books and superheroes and stuff like that. And they always enjoyed martial arts as something that they were interested in, and got into jiu-jitsu and then just became these killers. So I think that changed my perception a lot on the overall landscape of jiu-jitsu, because when you look at people, you think, oh, these guys must have been lifelong athletes, but surprisingly, most of them have not. Most of the guys that I've talked to anyways did not have much of an athletic background at all until they got to jiu-jitsu. So that's been an interesting one to me anyways. Question 4, what are some common themes in the training routines of successful BJJ athletes? Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, structure is a big thing with these guys. They seem to have very specific times that they train. They seem to know what they're working on when they're coming in. They know what the focus of the day is. And some of these guys will have it regimented in a way where not only do they know what they need to be working on for the day, they've got their weeks and months and even quarters of the year planned out about what they're going to be doing. And that's also influenced my personal note taking. Like with my note taking, I've taken it to a level now where if say my guard passing is kind of floundering and I need some help with my guard passing, I'll make it so that like the entire first quarter of the year or second quarter of the year is focused primarily around guard passing. And then I'll break it down by week, the things I want to drill and have accomplished, and then break that down by day. And that's all been inspired. I was inspired to do that by talking to a lot of these guys that structure and regiment their training in the way that they do. So I would say common themes in training routines is a lot of regimented schedules, a lot of structure. They also do a lot of specific training. So rather than just doing a free normal roll, they do a lot of specific positional training, where, say it's like a guard pass or sweep drill. If they land a sweep, they start back over in the same position and just continue that from that spot over and over again to really refine and get repetition on that specific little place that they're trying to improve upon in jiu-jitsu. So those are all things that I've seen them across the board doing. Question 5, what were any surprising and unexpected things you've learned about BJJ through your interviews? Let me think about that one. Something unexpected and surprising. The fact that everybody gets nervous, that was something that I've been very surprised to see. I remember in particular, I was talking to Buchecha, who's one of the greatest world champions of all time, and he was talking about how I can't remember exactly what I asked him, but it was along the lines of how do you manage nerves, or how did you manage nerves? I was talking in past tense because I figured by that point Buchecha probably doesn't get nervous at all for competitions. It turns out I was dead wrong. He still gets very nervous before a competition, even if it's not like a world level competition. He still feels nerves every single time he goes out and competes, and that's something that I've heard from a lot of different people too. I also interview a lot of NCAA Division I wrestlers, like NCAA champions and things like that. And they all say that despite the fact that they've had hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of matches, every single time they're still nervous and they have to go through their ritual that they go through and their self-talk that they go through to bring their nerves down and stay sharp mentally. So that's been a big one that surprised me, because I would have assumed that when you see a Hodger Gracie or a Buchecha or one of these big level guys stepping out on the mats, that they would be it would pretty much just be another day in the office. But the truth is they're still nervous even at that level. So that's been cool to hear. Question 6, could you share some of the most inspirational stories or quotes you've heard during your interviews? Man, that's a tough one. Let me think. I've had like I said, over 600 episodes. Let me think of the real inspiring. Well, okay, so one that comes to the top of my head is Dan Gable. I just mentioned I also interview wrestlers. Dan Gable, the wrestling American icon. I had him on the show a couple times, and the first conversation I had with him, he went into detail about the tragic story of his sister being murdered. And I believe this happened in either the late 60s or early 70s, and how it was kind of in the middle of his rise in wrestling at the high school level. And he was talking about how, despite the fact that he had this horrible family tragedy happen, he still had to show up to training. He'd wake up at 5 a.m. and be at training at 6. He'd still run through the cornfields of Iowa to stay conditioned every day. Basically, his regimen and his structure didn't change, even as he's running and crying, feeling as horrible as he did because of what happened to his sister. He still stayed true, and he did that partly in her memory. He knew that's what she would have wanted him to do. She would have wanted him to stay on this trajectory that he was on to become this legendary wrestler, which he certainly achieved. So that was very inspiring for me. It was a very emotional moment in the interview. He got a little choked up, and I appreciated him being so candid and sharing that story, because it's great inspiration for people that hear it. Another one would be Holz Gracie. Holz Gracie is he was a considered like the family champion back in the day. Him and Hickson were kind of neck to neck about who was kind of the best in the family at the time. And Holz's life was cut short tragically in the 80s in a hang gliding accident in Rio de Janeiro. And I interviewed a bunch of people close to him and also direct students of his in one episode. So it was kind of a one episode thing where it was a tribute to Holz, and I talked to 5 different people for about 15 minutes. I interviewed Renzo Gracie, my former instructor Jacare Cavalcanti. Jacare is the founder of Alliance team. And then we had his son, Hollis, on the show. And I talked to Hoyler and a few other people. But anyways, it was just inspiring to hear what tremendous of an impact one guy can have on so many people. And I was really blown away. I was expecting to hear kind of just, sort of the run-of-the-mill memories and funny stories. But what really came through in those conversations was just how deep of an impact he really made on those people, and by proxy, jiu-jitsu. Because a lot of the things, a lot of the concepts and the thoughts that he had on training and the direction of the art really seeped through into his students and his peers. And so that was really inspiring too. So those are the two I can think of off the top of my head. I know as soon as I turn this video off, I'm going to come up with 5 other ones immediately. But in the moment, Dan Gable getting through his family tragedy and staying on track to be a champion, and the impact that Holes Gracie had on everyone around him. Those were two of the most inspirational for me. Question 7, how have the athletes you've interviewed approached overcoming injuries or setbacks? Man, that's a good question. This one's actually led to something pretty interesting that I've heard over and over again, is that injuries, while they're frustrating, can sometimes be a blessing. I'll give you 2 examples. I interviewed Pedro Sauer. Pedro Sauer talked about how he's had multiple surgeries. I think Pedro Sauer's probably had more surgeries than anyone I know. He's had multiple shoulder surgeries, multiple knee surgeries, and various amounts of other things. It might have been something in his spine too, if like a disc or something, if I'm remembering correctly. But anyways, he was talking about how there's been certain aspects of his game, certain techniques that he relies on that he would never have relied on or even really thought about had he not had to be working around an injury. For Pedro specifically, I remember him talking about the bully pass. The bully pass is a closed guard technique. It's a technique to pass the closed guard that he uses almost at will. I mean, he effortlessly opens up closed guards with this technique. And he said that if it wasn't for his shoulder injury, he never would have changed the way that he was previously opening closed guard. And so he would, as a result, he would have never discovered the bully pass. And so that's a good example of someone discovering something new in their game or improving something because of having to work around an injury. And then, of course, the biggest example of this of all, in my opinion, would be Gordo, Roberto Gordo. Gordo is credited with being the innovator and kind of the main developer of the modern half guard. So before Gordo, half guard was more of a position that was used for recovery and for kind of retention. If you were getting your guard passed, you would try to get back to half guard, or at least keep half guard to get your full guard back. Well, Gordo's the first one that really started using it for sweeps and for submission attempts and for transitions and things like that. And that all happened because he had a bad knee injury and he couldn't play full guard anymore. And so he had to find a place where he could safely be, that would keep his knee safe. And so he started playing with half guard. And as he was using half guard more and more, he started to realize, man, if I isolate the guy's arm here and tip him this way, I can sweep him. And if he bases out this way, I can do this or that. And so it led to this whole revolution of the half guard. It completely changed the position from what it used to be to what we know it as now. So anyways, as far as overcoming injuries and setbacks, that's been something that I've found really interesting, is that sometimes injuries can be a blessing. It can make you sit back and have to really study your game a little bit better. It can force you to do other things that you might not normally do because it's not your A game. So while injuries suck, and we all go through them at some point, don't be too down on it. It can sometimes lead to something cool. So question 8, what are some common mental strategies or mindset techniques used by the BJJ athletes you've spoken with? 2 big ones: meditation and visualization. That's something that comes up a lot. They talk about the importance of meditating and visualizing your matches and your performances. So that's something I think a lot of athletes, even outside of jiu-jitsu, use visualization as an important tool. Another thing in jiu-jitsu is the idea that nobody cares as much as you. I think dealing with pressure of being in a tournament and being in a match, all the athletes have kind of across the board said that at the end of the day, you have to remember that nobody cares about your match as much as you do. So the people that are in the crowd, the people that are watching on streaming services and things like that, they're not going to remember your match the second it's over. And usually halfway through watching your match, they're watching other matches at the same time. And usually they're there to support teammates or a family member. that's out there competing. So no one cares as much as you do. And I think that's an important thing to remember for mental performance, because sometimes when you compete, you can be a little overwhelmed with, oh man, I got all these eyes on me. It's a tournament. You know, I want to make my school look good. I don't want to make my instructor look bad. You know, I don't want to I don't want to have a poor performance here. And it's important to hear it again, that no one cares as much as you do. So that's something I've heard a lot on the show. Question 9, what would you say sets apart elite level athletes from the rest based on your interviews? That's a very good question. And there's one thing in particular that I've noticed, that there's a spectrum to this, because, you know, there's some do this more intensely than others, but it's an obsession for perfection. The first time I ever noticed this was when I interviewed Roger Gracie. I've interviewed Roger a few times at this point, and the first time I interviewed him, he went into this a very candid moment, actually. It was a very honest moment he had with me, where I asked him, you know, about one of his world championship performances he had. He went through this whole thing where he beat everybody. He submitted everybody at one of the world championships all the way to the gold medal. And I was asking him about that performance, thinking he was just going to talk about how great it was and how cool and how he felt. And I remember there was this tone of kind of frustration when he was thinking about it, because he was talking about how he went through, his goal was to go through and not get a single point scored on him or anything. He went through and submitted everybody, but at one point he didn't land a sweep that he was trying to land. He really wanted to land this sweep and then capitalize off of that. And the guy was able to defend. So to be clear, he won the match by submission. He didn't get scored on. It's just that one of the things he was trying to do didn't work. And after winning the gold medal, that bothered him for like months and months and months, that he couldn't land that sweep. And when he went into that with me, I kind of, man, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was like, man, talk about just the deepest level of obsession for being perfect. And that, I truly think, is what sets Roger apart, and guys like Roger. Gordon Ryan, I interviewed Gordon Ryan before, and he had the same kind of thing. Like, he was very deeply obsessed with being perfect in his technique. And that's the kind of thing, I think that's an ingredient you kind of have to have at that level. Everything has to be flawless. And for those guys, again, with using Roger as the example, it wasn't enough for Roger that he won the gold, and not only did he win the gold, he submitted everybody along the way. That wasn't enough. It was that during that whole run in the tournament, someone defended something he was trying to do, and that ate away at him. So whether that's healthy or not for most people, I don't know. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I will say that is something that's definitely present in the minds of the top elite athlete guys, is an obsession for perfection. Question number 10. Are there any misconceptions about BJJ that your interviews have helped clarify or debunk? Yeah, I think I'll probably just go back to what I said earlier about there being a lot of non-athletes and kind of more nerdy type of people in jiu-jitsu. I think that a common misconception a lot of people would have about jiu-jitsu is that it's full of meatheads and stuff like that. And man, that couldn't be further from the truth. There's a lot of people that are very analytical types. There's very engineering, analytical type of people that are certainly not meatheads. And some of them are some of the most dangerous guys in the room. I remember my first 3 or 4 months of training, I was a brand new white belt, and there was this guy who was also a white belt, but he'd been there a little longer than me, and he was half my weight, and he was a computer programmer, and he didn't look anything. I mean, if you saw him on the street, you'd figure, man, this guy's never been in a fight in his life. And we rolled, and I mean, he smoked me. And I was just like, dude, what in the world? So that's when I realized that, like, you know, this is an art that anybody can do. Anyone can be good at it if they dedicate themselves to it. And it's cool when you see people who are real intelligent and real smart, analytical people who understand games and problem solving and things like that, because that's pretty much what jiu-jitsu is. So a big misconception I think that my show has helped with people that are new to the sport is that there's a lot less meatheads than you think. It's a lot more kind of nerdy, analytical, smart people involved. Question 11, can you describe some of the unique training methods or philosophies you've heard about through interviews? Yeah, I guess the big one would be positional training, as I mentioned earlier. A lot of guys focus mostly on positional training to sharpen up the areas of their games they're trying to improve on. It's not so much that they just do hours and hours and hours of free rolling. It's that they do lots of free rolling, but they also do lots and lots of positional sparring to fix specific parts of their game. Another thing would be in common in recent years is ice baths. It seems like everybody's on this ice bath thing. I've actually purchased an ice bath of my own. I haven't used it yet. It's still being shipped to me. But apparently, from what everyone has told me, and this is great for the over 40 crowd, because I'm 38, so I'm not quite 40 yet, but I am feeling more soreness than I ever did before, that's for sure. And everyone that uses ice baths tells me, like, man, I can get into an ice bath after a hard training session. I get out and I feel like I could go train again right now. So I'm going to put that to the test myself to see how it goes for me. But a lot of people seem to be doing that, and a lot of people mention it on the show as well. Okay, let's see. Question 12. How do BJJ athletes balance their rigorous training schedules with their personal life according to your interviews? Man, that's a great question, because that's something that I'm always impressed by. I'm always impressed by the ability for a world champion level athlete to run a school, have a family, do seminars around the world, and then still have time to train and compete at the highest levels. The big thing, I think, is just, again, discipline and having sticking to a schedule. Just having a real specific schedule. They know where they're supposed to be from the time they wake up until the time they go to bed. That's not one of my personal skills that I have. I'm still trying every day to get better at time management. I've got 2 kids of my own, and I run the podcast, and I try to balance my training and competition and stuff around all that as myself. But I do see people doing it at the highest level, and they seem to have a system down. So I think it's just systemizing your schedule and your days, understanding, where you're supposed to be by what time, what you should have eaten already, how much water you should have drank already, and balancing out your schedule based on that. So that's something I wish I was better at. I wish I had better insight on that. But from what I've seen other people do, it's all about the regimen and the schedule. Let's see. Question 13. Have you observed any common dietary or lifestyle habits among successful BJJ athletes? Yeah, they all take their recovery. Really seriously. So the ice baths, massages, cryotherapy, chiropractic. They do lots of things outside the mats to ensure that they're recovered, preventing injuries. Strength and conditioning obviously is another big one. Strength and conditioning is another one that they use a lot for injury prevention. And that resonates with me personally too, because every single time that I can think of when I've had a bad injury from training, it's usually during a time that I've been slacking off on my weightlifting. So if I've been lifting or doing some kind of conditioning outside of jiu-jitsu, I find that I don't get hurt nearly as much. And that's something that I've heard a lot of them testify to as well. So they take their recovery seriously, and they also don't eat or drink poorly. They have a pretty good diet, and they take their supplements and their vitamins and their hydration and things like that very seriously. So pretty much what you'd expect from most professional athletes or full-time athletes. Food intake, diet, hydration, and taking recovery seriously is for sure at the top of that list. Question 14. What advice have your guests given to aspiring BJJ athletes or beginners in the sport? Yeah, for athletes, dive right in. That's the advice that I've heard and that I would personally give as well, is dive in, train as often. If you want to be a serious jiu-jitsu athlete and you want to compete and reach the highest levels you can, don't wait. Start training, start competing, do it often. Try to find a life balance that lets you do that. Try to find work that allows you to do it too. I know a lot of guys who are real serious on the jiu-jitsu athlete path who work, they work night jobs so they can train during the day. They might do Uber or DoorDash and things like that. They might crash on a couch. There's a lot of sacrifices you have to make because jiu-jitsu is not a very high-paying sport until you get to the real high levels. And thankfully, that is getting better all the time. It seems like jiu-jitsu really is a rapidly growing sport where people are going to be able to make a living as competitors sooner than later. But in the meantime, find that work and life balance that allows you to train regularly and just train as much as you possibly can. For everyday practitioners, I would say the best advice would be not to gloss over the basics. Focus real hard on the basics. Avoid overly flashy techniques when you're new, because those really only work if your fundamentals are solid. And the person that I think really drove that home for me was Jeff Glover. Jeff Glover is one of my favorite athletes to watch from back in the day, and he has a real experimental, fun, kind of flashy game, but he emphasized in my conversation I had with him that the only reason he can do any of that stuff is because his fundamentals are so solid. So if he does something real experimental and flashy and fancy, if it fails, it's no big deal because he can fall right back onto his fundamentals, which keep him very safe and effective. So for aspiring jiu-jitsu athletes, I would say the advice would be dive right in, compete as often as you can, train as often as you can. For the everyday athlete that wants to get better and better, focus on the fundamentals. The fundamentals will stick with you forever, and they allow you to be a lot more. They allow you to take more risks without putting yourself in terrible positions. Because if you can escape a bad position, you don't have as much to fear if something fails. So, question 15: can you discuss the importance of a supportive community or team based off your interviews and with BJJ athletes? Yes, 100%. So find the right school. This is a big one that I've gone through myself, and it's something that's come up on the show a lot. Definitely take the time to find the right school for you. Also, I think this is important for people to hear. This is my personal opinion. You are a customer in a free market. So this whole idea that if you leave a team because it's not working for you, that you're some sort of traitor or you're some sort of backstabber or whatever, that's absolute nonsense. You are paying money to pursue jiu-jitsu. This is supposed to be something that you enjoy. You should absolutely be trying multiple schools out, see which one meshes with you the best, and then commit to that school. Do not get yourself stuck into a negative or toxic environment just because you have some idea in your head that people are going to label you a traitor. I would much rather be a traitor that left a toxic or bad place to go somewhere great than a coward who stays somewhere that's terrible for me in my mind and my experience. So I'm passionate about that topic. I've had a few of those in my years of training where I've stayed in places longer than I should have. So I hate to see people making the same mistakes. So find the right school. You're a customer at the end of the day, and stay loyal once loyalty's been given to you, for sure. Question 16: how have your interviews highlighted the evolution of BJJ over time? Good question. So when I first started training, my first class I ever had was late 2005, and then I took a long break in between. But I remember that when I first arrived in jiu-jitsu was still very much tied to fighting. It was tied to MMA, and actually at the time I started, it was still very much in kind of what they call the NHB days, which is no holds barred. So that's kind of the early MMA when they hadn't quite had all the rules ironed out yet, and there was a lot of events and fight promotions that didn't have athletic licenses and were kind of operating underground. It was kind of the Wild West of the early fight circuit days. And I remember that a lot of the guys that were involved in jiu-jitsu at the gyms I was going to were mostly focused on that. They were learning BJJ because they wanted to learn how to fight. And the people who weren't fighting competitively, they were real interested in just learning self-defense. So they were focused very much on jiu-jitsu for self-defense. Since then, the sport of jiu-jitsu has obviously blown up. It's become this really cool thing that a lot of people are involved in. And it's also kind of changed the landscape of jiu-jitsu, of why people train and what people are trying to do. And then over the years, it's also become kind of just this fun activity. It's even if you're not looking to learn how to fight or defend yourself necessarily, it's just a fun sport. It's a fun activity. It's a fun art to learn. And it's kind of like doing yoga, but you get to choke people. So it's kind of grown in a lot of different directions. On a technical level, I would say the biggest evolution I've seen in jiu-jitsu over time is the evolution of the leg lock game. When I first started jiu-jitsu, again, it was mostly focused on fighting, so leg locks weren't so much frowned upon. But when it got kind of into the more sportive side of jiu-jitsu, when those years kind of arrived, leg locks were almost kind of shunned. They were almost kind of looked down upon, like it was treated like it was some kind of like a cheap technique to use or something, which I never understood, because if you're isolating a leg, how's that any different than isolating any other part of the human anatomy? If you're attacking a Kimura or an armbar or a choke, man, you're grabbing a joint and you're stretching it beyond its breaking point, and you're causing the person to tap as a result. So whether that's an elbow or a shoulder or an ankle or a knee, I never understood the difference. But there was kind of this stigma. I remember there was a stigma of people kind of like poo-pooing on leg locks, but that's obviously changed dramatically now. So Professor John Danaher and Dean Lister inspired John Danaher. John Danaher systemized this whole leg lock system, which everyone has basically jumped on. And I remember when the Danaher Death Squad first came on the scene and were really wrecking everybody with leg locks, there was almost this arms race of people in jiu-jitsu trying to learn leg locks. They became kind of the main focus of training for a lot of people. And so that was a big evolution. And then nowadays I'm seeing a lot of influence in wrestling, which I think is awesome, because I love the sport of wrestling too. So I see a lot of people trying to incorporate wrestling techniques and concepts into their game, learning how to fight better off their feet rather than having to just sit guard or pull guard. So that's been some of the big evolutions in jiu-jitsu I've seen over time is culturally moving away from fighting and just self-defense to more of a combination of self-defense and the pursuit of a sport or just a fun activity. And then technically, the evolution of leg locks and the incorporation of wrestling techniques has been something cool that I've noticed along the way. Question 17. Have any of your guests discussed the role of BJJ in their life outside the gym? Yeah, definitely. In fact, that comes up a lot. We talk about all the time the benefits that jiu-jitsu has that translate over to day-to-day life. The two big ones are going to be problem-solving skills and grit. So being a little more durable, being a little more less prone to easily being defeated mentally and quitting and giving up on things. That's probably been the biggest impact it's had on me personally. When I was a young kid, I was very I had very little patience. I was kind of a lost guy. Like, I didn't have any direction. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't know what I wanted to be. And anything that seemed like it was challenging, I was just very lazy. I was very mentally lazy when I was a kid. If anything seemed like it was going to require effort or time, I just kind of be like, I don't feel like it. I'm just going to go hang out with my friends or sit on the couch or whatever. And jiu-jitsu completely changed that for me. It made me, it's taught me the value of sticking to something that's difficult and reaping the rewards as a result of sticking around. So grit and kind of having an indomitable way about yourself. And then problem solving. That's been another big one. I think that the problem solving skills that jiu-jitsu has taught me have absolutely been transferable to day-to-day life. And the people I talk to on the show all say those two things are the ones that commonly come up for them as well. Question 18, can you share any key pieces of advice that your guests have offered for progressing in BJJ skill levels? Yes, good question. Mimicking successful people who have the same body type or attributes as you is a really good one. Every time I talk to a different athlete or champion in jiu-jitsu, I usually ask them what their inspiration was coming up. I ask who their favorite jiu-jitsu athlete was, and usually they'll name someone who inspired them. So, if you have a tall, lanky guy, he'll often reference a tall, lanky guy that he studied. If you have a smaller guy that's just quick and fast, he'll obviously watch other small, quick, fast people as he's coming up. And that's a really good thing I recommend to you guys listening, is if you're trying to figure out what you should be doing with your game, find someone that has a similar body type or a similar game as yours. Even if they don't look like you physically, just look for someone that plays the same kind of positions, seems to like the same kind of attacks that you like, and just replicate them, mimic them. Definitely watch what they're doing and just mimic for sure. Question 19. From your interviews, how do BJJ athletes handle pressure or nerves during competitions? Yeah, so going back to what I was saying earlier, I think that everyone, even at the highest levels of the sport, feels some level of nerves and anxiety. I think it's important to remind yourself of that if you're nervous, the person on the other side of the mat is just as nervous, maybe even more so, but everyone's nervous. And just remind yourself of what you can control. That's a big thing that comes up a lot, is the importance of not thinking so much of things that you can't control, like how strong the other guy looks or how experienced he might look, or things you can't control any of those things. Think about the things that you can control. Think about your goals and your game, where you want to be, what positions you plan on taking the other person to, and focus on the controllables. That's been a really good piece of advice that a lot of athletes have mentioned to me over the years, and I think it makes the most sense. You only focus on what you can control. Everything else is just needless worry. If you can't control it, then you can only worry about it. So think about what you can control. And question 20, this is the last question of the day. Finally, having interviewed so many BJJ athletes, what advice would you offer to someone just starting out in jiu-jitsu? Great question. I actually have a couple things that I would give advice on for brand new white belts. The big one, the most important one of all, if you're a white belt in jiu-jitsu, cherish this chapter of your journey. Seriously. Like, you're at this special place in jiu-jitsu right now where no one expects anything of you. You don't have to prove anyone to anybody. You are absolutely on a clean slate. Your only job, the only thing anyone asks of you is to show up and put in the work and learn. That's it. And it really is like a really pressure-free time in the journey. As you get higher and higher in belts in jiu-jitsu, you'll find that more and more pressure is placed on you, oftentimes from yourself. But you know, if you're competing or you're trying to graduate in class and things like that, there's just more there's more pressure there sometimes. Whereas with a white belt, the only thing you got to do is show up. No one is expecting anything from you any further than that. So that's something I wish I took a little more seriously. I remember when I was a white belt, I hated the feeling of being like a newbie and being like being the guy that doesn't know anything and is kind of ignorant to what we're doing. And I used to, as quickly as possible, want to be able to prove myself and show that I'm learning and that I can move up to the next level. And as a result, I rushed through a lot of my stuff that I should have just been taking my time to enjoy and learn. And if you skip and rush through anything in jiu-jitsu, at some point that's going to get exposed and you're going to have to circle back around and fix those holes. So fix the holes and learn all your fundamentals and focus on them very hard in the beginning so you don't have to repeat and learn jiu-jitsu twice. I just had a great conversation with Hyden Gracie, the son of Ryan Gracie, who talked about that specific topic, about not learning jiu-jitsu twice. That's a really important thing to understand. The second thing would be keep a journal. As I said, the number one thing, if you ask me what my biggest regret in my whole jiu-jitsu journey has been, is not taking a journal since day one. I would have kept a journal from day one. I wish I had a whole like library stack on my walls of notebooks from the time I started training until today. The first journal I have is from when I was a purple belt after my conversation with Rafael Lovato that I mentioned earlier. So yeah, if you can just embrace being a white belt and keep a journal every single time you train. Write down what happened, what you were frustrated with, what you did well, things that you want to try for next time. So that way when you come to the next class, you kind of know what to be prepared for and what to try to use and improve upon. Those are two things I would really recommend. And guys, that was the last question I had. So I really appreciate everyone that sent in questions. Shout out to the BJJ After 40 Facebook group. And again, guys, congrats on your purchase of Mike's book. I'm sure you guys are really going to enjoy it. Mike, thanks again for the invite to do this. It was really a pleasure to get to share some of my thoughts and experiences through the conversations I've had. If you guys want to keep up with me, my Instagram is @GringoRyan. And again, the show is the BJJ Fanatics Podcast. It's available on YouTube and all podcast platforms. If you type in BJJ, it should be the first show that pops up in the results. Make sure you guys subscribe, leave me a good review if you don't mind, and reach out to me too. If you follow me on Instagram, reach out, let me know if this video helped, because I always enjoy hearing feedback about these kinds of things. So anyway, guys, thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate it, and see you in the future.